The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back, climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itchy. Dirty old hags like hers always have itchy tummies. Then, all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed." "I bet it's that giant skilly wiggler I saw on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. "The what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me! It's all over my feet." "It'll bite your toes off," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a cold jug of water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping on the pillows. Frogs love water. This one was having a great time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again. "By golly, it's the giant skilly wiggler," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite your nose off." Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew down the stairs to spend the night on the sofa. The frog went quietly to sleep on her pillow. Worm spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking it around with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat up whilst it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings round his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the normal kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating the worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful, and then she said, "Do you want to know why your plate was so squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with the corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it had a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. The funny walking stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took the walking stick downstairs to his work shed. There, he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small. The next morning, Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it so very neatly that the extra bits looked like part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly that you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is." Mrs. Twit looked at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong with it, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must have suddenly grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth's happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, it's you." Mr. Twit was grinning horribly. "It's you. You're getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're shrinking, woman," said Mr. Twit. "It's not possible." "Oh, yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never!" she cried. "Of course you have. Look at your stick, you old goat. See how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down.